The most powerful weapon in the War of the Ring was not an army of the living, but an army of the damned, bound by a single broken promise. Their curse was a justice so absolute, it makes the Doom of Mandos seem a negotiable sentence, for their crime was not against a king, but against the very hope of Middle-earth itself. This is the story of the men of the White Mountains, and the terrible oath they broke at the dawn of the Second Age. Long before the last days of the Third Age, before the name of Aragorn was ever spoken in Gondor, another king demanded allegiance in the war against the ultimate evil. This was Isildur, High King of the Realms in exile. In the shadow of the Black Years, as the last alliance of elves and men was forged to confront Sauron, he summoned the men of the mountains to fulfill their vows of loyalty. But they, having worshipped Sauron in the Dark Years, refused the call. They fled to their mountain holds, believing themselves safe from the new king's wrath. They were wrong. Upon the stone of Erech, Isildur cursed them. They would never know rest until their oath was fulfilled. They would dwindle and fade, becoming shadows of memory, trapped between worlds, until a day when his heir would call upon them again. Theirs was not a swift death, but an eternal, sleepless undeath, a chilling reminder that some promises are bound to the very soul of the world. To understand the weight of this curse, one must first understand the people upon whom it was laid. They were not mere bandits or wild men. The men of the White Mountains, the Ered Nimrais, were an ancient people, descendants of those who had awakened in the dawn of men but had never journeyed westwards towards the light of the Valar. They were a people of stone and shadow, their lives dictated by the harsh winds and the deep secrets of the high passes. While the Edain, the fathers of men, marched towards Beleriand and allied themselves with the elves, the ancestors of the Oathbreakers remained, a people apart, forgotten by the grand sweep of history. And into this isolation, a new power came. During the Second Age, as the light of Numenor grew in the west, the shadow of Sauron lengthened from the east. He came not always as a figure of terror, but sometimes as a bringer of order and a god who promised power. To the men of the mountains, who knew no other gods, his dominion was absolute. They bowed to him. They built idols to him. In their hearts, Sauron was their lord and master. They served him for centuries. Their devotion was a deep and primal thing, woven into the fabric of their culture. This was the world they knew, the unyielding mountains, and the dark god who ruled them. But how could a king of a fledgling realm dare to command a people who had worshipped a dark god for centuries? The answer came from across the sea. The world was broken and remade with the downfall of Numenor, the punishment for its people's pride and their own turn towards the worship of darkness. From that cataclysm, a handful of ships escaped, bearing Elendil the Tall and his sons Isildur and Anarion. They were the Dunedain, the men of the West, possessing a nobility, wisdom, and lifespan far beyond those of other men. They founded the realms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south, a bastion of light and memory against the encroaching darkness of Mordor. Isildur, co-ruler of Gondor, was no mere warlord. He was a prince of a drowned kingdom, a man who had seen the might of the Valar and the treachery of Sauron firsthand. His authority was immense, and his purpose was singular: to ensure the shadow that had consumed his home would not devour this new one. To do this, he needed allies. He needed to bind all the peoples of the land to his cause. His gaze fell upon the men of the mountains. He knew of their past, of their allegiance to his great enemy. Yet he offered them a chance to break from that past. He came to them not with an army, but with a symbol of immense power. From the wreck of Numenor, he had brought the stone of Erech. It was a great black sphere, featureless and cold to the touch, and it hummed with an ancient power. Upon this stone, on the hill that would bear its name, Isildur met with the king of the mountains. He did not ask them to forsake their homes or change their ways, only to swear a single, binding oath, that when the time came to fight Sauron, they would answer the call of Gondor's king. Faced with the majesty of the Númenórean king, and perhaps sensing the tide of power shifting in the world, the king of the mountains agreed. He swore allegiance to Isildur, and his people swore with him. The oath was made. The stone bore witness. But a promise made in the light of a new king is easily forgotten when the shadow of an old god returns. Years passed. Sauron, revealing his true form and malice, launched his war against the new realms of Mixout. The last alliance of elves and men was forged, a pact of desperation between Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, and Elendil, the High King of the Dunedain. It was a war to end all wars, a final, cataclysmic struggle for the very future of Middle-earth. The call went out. Every lord, every chieftain, every man capable of bearing arms was summoned to the war. Isildur sent word to the men of the mountains. Their time had come. Their oath was now due. But the men of the mountains had watched Sauron's power grow once more. The fear of their old master was greater than their loyalty to the new one. They remembered the power he commanded, a dark and terrible might that had held them in thrall for generations. They looked at the fledgling kingdom of Gondor, and then at the black fortress of Mordor. And they made their choice. They refused the call. They broke their oath. Believing themselves safe in their mountain fortresses, they hid from the war, convinced they could remain neutral while the world burned around them. They chose neutrality in the face of absolute evil. But in the calculus of Arda's great struggles, neutrality is a choice for the shadow, and the price for such a choice would be nothing less than their own souls. Isildur received the news of their betrayal not with sadness, but with a cold and terrible fury. It was a personal insult, a rejection of his authority, and a strategic blow to the forces of the alliance. But more than that, it was a profound act of treachery against the very hope of the free peoples. He did not send an army to punish them. There was no time. The greater war awaited. Instead, he went alone to the hill of Erech, to the very stone upon which the oath was sworn. As the mountain chieftains and their king watched from their high places, Isildur stood before the silent witness and spoke his curse. His voice was not loud, but it carried on the wind with the weight of doom, a king's justice made manifest. "Upon them I set this curse," he declared. "For their breaking of their oath, this doom shall be upon them and their children, that never shall they know rest until they have fulfilled it. For this war will last for years uncounted, and you shall be summoned again ere the end." The effect was not immediate death. It was something far worse. They began to dwindle. Their physical bodies wasted away over the long years of the war, but their spirits found no release. They were barred from the halls of the dead. Their souls were trapped, anchored to the physical world by the power of the curse, unable to move on, unable to find peace. They became the shadow host, the Oathbreakers. They fled from the light of the sun and the moon, hiding deep within the caves and tunnels of their own mountains. Their domain became a place of terror, a passage none of the living dared to tread. The paths of the dead, it came to be called. For 3,000 years they waited. The Second Age ended with Sauron's defeat, yet their oath remained unfulfilled, for their aid had not been given. The Third Age dawned. Gondor grew to its height of power, and then slowly began to fade. The line of Isildur failed in the north, and the line of Anarion failed in the south. The world changed, and still they waited. They became a legend, a ghost story told to frightened children in the vales of the White Mountains. A name of dread whispered by the people of Rohan and Gondor. The Dwemerberg, the haunted mountain, and the dark door that led to the paths of the dead were shunned by all living things. But a prophecy had been spoken, long ago, by the seer Malbeth. He foretold a day when all hope seemed lost, when Gondor would face its greatest peril. On that day, the heir of Isildur would come. He would walk the paths of the dead, a road no living man had ever survived. And he would call upon the Oathbreakers to finally, after millennia of torment, fulfill their promise. Their curse was absolute, their torment unending. They were an army of pure fear. Their touch the chill of the grave, their very presence a violation of the natural order. They answered to no living man, yet their doom was tied inextricably to the blood of the king they had betrayed. For thousands of years, they languished in their twilight prison, waiting for a summons that seemed like it would never come, waiting for an heir who no longer existed, waiting for an heir who no longer existed. Or so they, and all the world, believed. But what if we've been looking at the curse all wrong? What if Isildur's decree wasn't merely an act of furious vengeance? What if, in that moment of white-hot rage on the hill of Erech, he was also demonstrating the most profound, ruthless foresight? Think about it. Isildur didn't just condemn them to suffer. He preserved them. He denied them both life and death, locking their martial power in a state of eternal readiness. He forged an army that could not be killed because it was already dead. An army that could not be bribed, for what can you offer a ghost? An army that could not be turned by Sauron, because their souls were already shackled by a more ancient and personal doom. Isildur, in his fury, didn't just punish Oathbreakers. He created the ultimate contingency, a secret weapon, hidden from the world in the heart of a mountain, bound by blood, and waiting for the one thing Sauron could never counterfeit: the true heir of Elendil. But what was this existence like for the Oathbreakers themselves? For 3,000 years, they were prisoners in their own homes, observers of their own decay. They watched the sun rise and set as a gray smear in a sky they could not feel. They heard the wind howl through passes they could no longer walk. Their memories of life, of warmth, of taste and touch, would have faded like mist, eroded by the sheer, monotonous weight of time. All that remained was the cold, hard stone of their failure. The oath, broken. The curse, eternal. A singular, burning shame that became the entirety of their being. Their torment wasn't pain. It was absence. The absence of rest, of peace, of conclusion. They were a sentence without a full stop, a story trapped on its final, agonizing page. And over the millennia, this torment festered. It turned into a chilling, desperate power. While they could not touch the physical world, their collective despair and dread became a palpable force, a psychic barrier. They were not entirely alone in their vigil. Legends of the silent army drew the foolish and the brave. Over the long centuries, others tried to breach the paths of the dead. Great lords of Gondor, in the pride of their youth, seeking a legendary host to command. Desperate men of Rohan fleeing from defeat, hoping to find an impossible ally. None of them were the heir. To them, the dead offered no parley, only terror, a crushing, soul-withering fear that emanated from the very stones. A silent scream of, "You are not him." Most fled, their minds broken. Some were never seen again, their spirits perhaps lost forever in that lightless labyrinth, swallowed by the sheer despair of the place. And what of the enemy? Did Sauron know of this spectral legion sleeping in his enemy's backyard? It is almost certain the Lord of the Rings was a master of spirits, a commander of wraiths. His own Nazgul were beings held between worlds by rings of power. He would have felt the presence of the Oathbreakers, this great congregation of trapped souls. So why didn't he claim them? Why didn't the Lord of the Dead simply command the dead? The answer lies in the genius of Isildur's curse. It was a lock to which only one key existed. Sauron's will, which could dominate orcs, men, and even bend the spirits of the Nazgul, found no purchase here. The Oathbreakers were already enslaved by a prior and more potent magic, the power of a sacred oath, sworn on a holy stone and broken before a high king of Numenor. They were shielded from Sauron's influence, an island of immunity in his sea of corruption. To him, they were a potential threat he could not neutralize, a weapon he could not wield, a loose thread in his grand design, waiting to be pulled. And then, after 3 millennia, the thread was pulled. But here is where the story we think we know takes a darker, more complicated turn. We assume the King of the Dead simply waited, desperate for release. But what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if 3,000 years of undeath had warped his very soul? What if, in that shadowy realm, he had forged an ambition far more terrifying than simply breaking a curse? His ambition was not freedom. Freedom was an ending, a final peace he had long since forgotten how to desire. His ambition was continuation. For 3,000 years he had been a king of nothing, ruling an empire of echoes. Now before him stood the key to a physical kingdom, and the means to conquer it. He would fulfill the oath. He would sweep Sauron's filth from the fields of Gondor. And in the vacuum, he would remain a new lord, not of fire and iron, but of silence and dread. The charge of the dead at the Harlan docks was not a charge at all. It was a tide, a silent, gray tsunami of despair that washed over the corsairs of Umbar and the armies of Harad. There were no war cries, no clash of steel. There was only the sound of living hearts stomping in unison, of terrified breath stolen from 1,000 throats at once. The dead did not kill with spectral blades. They killed with their very presence, an aura of absolute hopelessness so potent it extinguished the flame of life itself. And when the last of Sauron's forces were swept away, when the unnatural darkness over the Pelennor began to recede, Aragorn stood before the spectral host and spoke the words they had waited an eternity to hear. "The oath is fulfilled. Go, be at peace." But they did not go. The wind did not stir them. The King of the Dead drifted forward, his form now almost solid in its sheer malevolence. "Peace?" his voice whispered, a sound like dust scraping on a tomb lid. "We have forgotten peace. We have learned a new craft in the dark. This world is loud and violent and full of pain. We will give it the gift of silence, the gift of order, the gift of us." This was the final test, the one Isildur's pride could never have foreseen. Not a battle of swords, but a war for reality itself. Aragorn was outmatched, outnumbered, by an enemy that could not be fought. But he held the one weapon that still had power here. Not the blade of Anduril, but the blood of Elendil. He held up his hand, not in command, but in judgment. "You swore an oath to the King of Gondor," he boomed, his voice imbued with the authority of his entire line. "You did not swear to become its new shadow. I am the heir, and I do not release you. I dismiss you." "Your torment is your own," Aragorn continued, his voice ringing with finality. "You will not make it the worlds. You are bound by my word, and my word is an end." He drove the point of his declaration home, and the ancient magic, the source of their curse, finally overwhelmed the new ambition forged in darkness. The king of the dead let out a silent, agonized scream, not of pain, but of a crown being snatched from his grasp. His form, and that of his entire army, began to unravel. They were not peacefully fading. They were being forcibly erased. Aragorn stood alone, the true victor not just of a battle, but of a temptation that could have plunged Middle-earth into a new, quieter, and perhaps more terrible age of darkness. He had not just defeated an enemy, but unmade a god in its cradle. The history books would remember his victory, but only he would know how close he came to unleashing a far greater doom. Some stories are never fully told, their deepest truths buried like forgotten kings in the heart of a mountain. The tale of the Oathbreakers is one of them. And here, we search for those hidden truths, the forgotten verses in the grand song of Arda. If you hunger for the deeper lore and the stories between the lines, then join our fellowship. Subscribe to the _Silmarillion_Chronicles, and let us continue the journey into the shadows of the past, together.